Hi, thank you for coming. You can't hear the music as well, so I was just making sure the jazz went out gently. I'm Lynn Tomaszewski. I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs here at Cranbrook Art Academy. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm here to introduce Hamza Walker, who I will keep it incredibly short. This is the second of our Academy-wide public lecture series, and we are thrilled that Hamza has come all the way from LA to the cold tundra of the Midwest to join us. This year's lecture series is supported by the Gilbert Family Foundation, and we are very grateful for their generous support of all of these lectures. So without further ado, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hamza. Hamza Walker is the director of Lax Art, a nonprofit art space in Los Angeles. Prior to joining Lax Art in 2016, he was director of education and associate curator at the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago, a non-collecting contemporary art museum. At Lax Art, he has recently curated shows including Nikita Gale, Takers from 2022, Candace Williams Cassandra Presses, The Absolute Right to Exclusion from 2021, and Post Commodities, Some Reach While Others Clap from 2020. Over his career, Hamza has curated over 40 exhibitions. He's in demand as a speaker. He's given lectures and served as a critic at almost every institution of higher education that you can think of. He serves on the board currently of the Graham Foundation. I had the pleasure of working with Hamza while I was at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago as a graduate dean, and one of the things I remember most about Hamza while he was at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago was his enormous generosity as a faculty member. I got the weird request from my dean to write to Hamza and tell him to stop letting so many students into his graduate seminars, because people were complaining they couldn't fit in the crit room anymore, and he didn't do it. He ignored me, and that was just the way it was going to be with Hamza, and there were still more people wanting to get in to work with him and to speak with him. So I will always remember Hamza's generosity, and he left a strong impression on me, and I know many, many others. His reach is wide, and I am so thrilled that he is joining us here as a member of our community for a short period of time. So please help me welcome Hamza Walker.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to be back on the tundra. My first stop was REI. I had to go and get a base layer, in terms of remembering my roots, and also running around Bloomfield Hills. A black man running around all ashy, bringing shame to his family. So I remembered what lotion is for. LA's made me soft. This is another way of saying winter here is hard. But I'm glad to be back. But in terms of past, I thought I would start with a piece of my past before the Renaissance Society, with this beautiful painting by Kerry James Marshall, just as a preamble to talking about an exhibition that I'm currently working on called Monuments, and you'll see and know all about it in a second. And I worked for the city of Chicago for almost 5 years as a public art coordinator. And in that capacity, I was charged with administering the Percent for Art ordinance, which is about taking a percentage of the construction budget for public facilities for the purchase and display of artwork in buildings that had public accessibility. And so I had a series of branch libraries under my purview. And so in terms of commissioning artworks, and this is one of the projects I'm probably most proud of, and it happened at the very end of my tenure with the city. And it was 2 artists chosen for a library on the west side of Chicago, the Legler Branch Library. It's a beautiful Beaux-Arts building at Monroe and Pulaski, Madison and Pulaski. And it was Kerry James Marshall and Elizabeth Catlett. And so this is just, here's a better view of it. And Carrie's super soul brother number one, who's like an older brother. I actually suspended the democratic process for this project. And I told the panel that was charged with selecting an artwork, I said, look, there's an artist named Carrie James Marshall, and I happen to know one of his weaknesses. And he told me once, he said, I've always wanted, he has two, I know it's two weaknesses. He said, I've always wanted to do an album cover and a children's book. And so when this project came along, this painting, which is like 24 feet by 10, 11 feet high, it's outside of a children's library. And so I said, look, this is the last chance the city of Chicago is going to have to be able to get anywhere near acquiring a work by Carrie James Marshall. So I took the entire panel to his studio, and they loved him. You know, at first they were just like, why are the figures in the paintings always that black? You know, so they were reading it as like, you know, they didn't know how to read the works. And I said, now you got to go see him and meet him. So this is his piece in that space. And then here's Elizabeth Catlett. Sorry for the crummy slide. I couldn't find I had a better slide of the piece. But a beautiful piece suspended over the circulation desk in that mezzanine. So this oculus in front, right. So the Elizabeth Catlett is right down in the middle of that oculus. Is oculus the right word? I don't think so. So there it is. So that's the past, now the future. We just bought a building for our work. So this furniture and mattresses, 70% off, custom bed and sofa. It's, for those of you who might know LA, it's on Western Avenue, just south of Melrose. This is the back of the building. That picture of the front is now boarded up. We're doing a whole plaster facade on the front. But in terms of just where my head is now, outside of monuments, it's in getting this building open. So right now, it looks like we're going to be able to move in March. But yeah, this is the back of the building, all tricked out. You can see the seismic retrofitting. Love those beautiful La Cantina doors, quite fancy. This is a view of the inside. So it's 5,000 square feet, 50 feet by 100 feet, an old furniture showroom. So yeah, so it's been we took possession of the building a year and a half ago, but because of the permitting process, we had to put skylights in, and it's a brick building in Los Angeles, so we wanted to poke 14 holes in the ceiling, in the roof. And once you poke 14 holes in a roof of a one-story brick building, that raises all kinds of red flags go up in terms of structural, right? So the building, the roof performs a structural function. It keeps the building from doing this. So we had to go back and forth with the city on engineering stuff and come up with solutions for it. But wanted to keep it open and unbroken as a space. So these beautiful accordion doors. Yeah, here you can get a sense of scale. That'll be a courtyard in the back. So just sharing with you where my present joys and anxieties lay. So on to the actual discussion this evening. And a lot of slides. I'm going to try and cover a lot of ground. So the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print, all the slides that are fit to show within a 45-minute period, I guess. Working on an exhibition just simply titled Monuments. It has a very simple conceit. It is, we're borrowing 15 monuments, the core of which are decommissioned Confederate monuments. And we're showing those alongside works of contemporary art. And the works of contemporary art are both commissions and pre-existing works. So I'll show you slides of what we're up to on that front. But I thought I would talk a little bit about a couple of exhibitions from the way back, 2008, 2009, that I think informed the framing of this exhibition in an interesting way. I did a presentation for monuments in Europe, and it was very interesting. At the very end of the talk, someone asked the question, yeah, well, but what is your theoretical basis for the exhibition? Like, have you been reading Christina Sharp? And I was like, what a weird question, like, it's like, no, this is all about U.S. history in like a very specific and hardcore kind of way. But then it just raised the question about like organizing exhibitions, right? How do exhibitions come into being, right? The frameworks for exhibitions. And but I thought it was just such an interesting question after the presentation. There are different kinds of exhibitions, different organizing principles for exhibitions, but it just got me thinking about the context, how monuments came into being, and I thought I would try talking about it in relationship to two earlier exhibitions. One which is very much kind of has a theoretical basis of sorts, and the other which is about race, which is Black Aint, which is this show that I'm going to show, which actually came to Detroit. It was at MOCA when Luis was there. Luis, what is Luis's last name? I love Luis. Then he went to the Henry after that. And right now, where's he, at the Rose? I think he's at the Rose. Yeah. So this is Black Aint, an exhibition I organized in 2008. But yeah, I thought I would share the file for the exhibition. Where did this exhibition kind of come from, in a way? And it was something of a, I can't say belated, response to Thelma Golden's show Freestyle, where she made the premise of the show was, okay, you have a whole generation of young Black artists who are no longer obligated to address the issue of race. And and actually wrote for the catalog, and I mean, it's Thelma's just a dear heart. And I was just like, yeah, Thelma, but where does that leave the issue of race? It's like, yes, Elvis has left the building, but the building is still there. So that was kind of the, so I kept thinking about that for quite a while after Freestyle before coming up with this exhibition as something of a response to it. So yeah. So in terms of thinking my way through it, exhibitions as they talk to other exhibitions. So in terms of organizing an exhibition, these were the other exhibitions that I had in mind, right? I think of exhibition making and exhibitions, their ability to be discursive, to talk to other exhibitions. So Whiteness, A Wayward Construction, Tyler Stallings, Maurice Berger, the late Maurice Berger, fell victim to COVID, right? Whiteness and Race in Contemporary Art. Valerie's Double Consciousness show, Black Art and Conceptualism, Thelma's Black Romantics, and then Freestyle, and then also Blackmail, right? The seminal show she did at the Whitney, right? So now this is my file from that time. So these were articles, and so this person asked about the theoretical basis for the exhibition. I was like, no, in theory, that's not, organizing exhibitions sometimes, different sources of inspiration, right? Much more, and they can come from high and low, right? So this was one of the articles that I kept and cut out around, and this is like a 2007, would have been a 2006, 2007 article. It turns out that Al Sharpton is the descendant of slaves that were owned by Strom Thurmond's family. I don't know for any of you who know, I assume you all know who Al Sharpton is, but the late Senator Strom Thurmond, who ran on the segregationist platform, right? He was the longest serving U.S. senator, right? Just the ironies of history being so great, right? Here's another clipping, right? The NAACP holding a funeral for the N-word. Obviously, it came back to life. Symbolic end. And I think this was in Detroit, actually. Yeah. Black firsts. Right. I used to joke as a kid with my mom. It's like, it's like, no. It's like, how about the 11th black astronaut? I don't know. Will we be counting then? Right. So Obama, he hadn't announced his bid for presidency at the time, right? But then when the issue of race emerged, then he gave what is now what I consider one of the great pieces of oratory, right? The speech on race. And it's so funny to see this picture of him. Right. Public housing, how is race configured? Right, to talk about it geographically. Public housing, the dismantling of the high-rises, the Robert Taylor homes, Cabrini Green, right? A major event, I think, in my lifetime. At least I never expected to see those towers come down. But to see developers, reconfigure what low-income housing could be, right? It's kind of mixed neighborhoods that presented all kinds of problems in terms of the market and how they wanted to structure the building of the housing in relationship to the market. Right? Katrina. Right? Right, and the distribution of resources in the wake of Katrina. Right? And now that it's finally been completely dismantled, right? Affirmative action, right? This is one of the early death knells for affirmative action, right, at the time, right? And I just like the photographs, right, that tell a story in and of themselves. Right? This Nivea ad, right? And this is, I took this photograph, this is 57th and Cottage Grove, Chicago. Right? My skin refuses to be taken for granted by anyone. Right? This was an ad that Dove pulled. They didn't, they received complaints because it was like before and after. It's like, oh, use the product and you will become whiter and thinner. Which was amazing that they pulled this ad. Right, this was my coffee sleeve, right, mixed chicks. And it's very funny now, my son, and I love the term mixed, this cracks me up as a term, his mother is white, she swears by this conditioner for his hair. Tickles me to no end. Right, this ad, right, which is a play on, I see dead people, right? So the show proper, right? This was the calling card for the show. This is by Carl Pope, and it was a poster that was sent out to about 8,000 people, right? So there you can see it on the left. Just put it on the wall, and it also had the essay for the exhibition. So this is the entrance. Glenn Ligon in the background, Negro Sunshine. And I'll just go through these quickly, installation views. Right, Andre Serrano on the left, Demetrius Oliver in the background. That stack of tape decks with the Mao. That's the late Terry Adkins. Beautiful piece from Terry. Foreground, Paul D'Amato. This beautiful photograph. A woman named Tasha. He did these formal portraits of residents of of different Chicago housing projects. But it's called Tasha. Her name, it just reminds me of a girl with a pearl earring. And the turn of her body. It's Rodney McMillian and Robert Pruitt, Todd Gray, left in the foreground. It's Hank Willis Thomas on the right, Popel in the background. I love this piece by Rodney McMillian, artist in Los Angeles. It's a chair that he found. I love this piece. And I had to make my case to Rodney as to why I was including it in a show about race. And he's like, the chair has nothing to do with race. And I said, hear me out, Rodney. Just Los Angeles is the epicenter of a certain aspect I think, a crucial aspect of a black aesthetic, the transformation of found materials, right? Assemblage, right? Noah Purifoy, Betty Saar. This is a really key, to take something of very little value or worth that is abject and turn it into a thing of beauty, whatever you want to do with that metaphor. But it as a staple of what would be called a black aesthetic in a sense. But again, a number of artists working in the 60s and 70s in Los Angeles. And Rodney finding himself, in Los Angeles. But what I liked about the chair was the fact that he just found it, had it, retooled structurally so that it would stay exactly as it is and wouldn't further deteriorate. But the idea that it was, no less fucked up in the gallery as it was on the street, and so which is absolutely zero transformation, right? That's quite beautiful, almost like a refutation of that. Jonathan Calm. It was great. Kerry James Marshall saw these photographs, which are really bad in a way as a species of photo 101. But these are all high-rise projects. These are the Baruch homes in New York. And Kerry James Marshall, Kerry saw these photographs and he goes, wow, cabin in the sky. It's really beautiful. Some more installation views. And this is Daniel. I'm going to blank on Daniel's last name, an artist from Germany. Piece. So yeah, so that was Black is, Black ain't. Now the next show is Several Silences, 2009. And this show takes its title from Jean-Francois Lyotard, one of the key French theoreticians who wrote extensively about postmodernism. And Several Silences is quite a beautiful essay, kind of obtuse be the word? I think obtuse is the word I'm looking for to describe it. So I was quite intrigued with the title of the essay, in addition to certain aspects of its contents. And so the show is titled for him. But it's really nice to actually bring this beat back. Those video monitors are a piece by Harry Shearer called Silent Echo Chamber, the Echo Chamber of Silence, I can't remember which. And Harry Shearer, the comedian, Spinal Tap, Best in Show, he, as an industry insider, got access to footage of talking heads, pundits, in the moments when they're on television before they speak. So they're either waiting for the segment that they're on to begin or they're listening, But in a lot of cases, they're just sitting there in silence. So there were these kind of strange, almost like Warhol-like screen tests of well-known figures just sitting there before the camera in silence. And so you've got Obama, James Carville, John McCain, who all else is in there? But I reserved the biggest screen for Henry Kissinger, who died yesterday, right? And I was just like, if anybody's going to sit in silence and has a lot of secrets to tell, it's Henry K. And so, very telling to see this slide. I'd forgotten about that. So yeah, Ryan Gander, the crystal balls that are scattered around. Troy Brontek, background. And the show was literally about silences. Right? And these Troy Brontek pieces, they're Conti crayon on muslin. Troy Brontek, a key figure from the pictures generation. But the photograph that he used was from the Joseph Banks clothier down in the financial district right after September 11th. It was filled with dust, but it made the containers for men's shirts, it turned them into this eerie catacomb. And it was great. Two people in the saw the show, two friends, Doug Ishar, and you remember Doug Ishar, Rebecca, from Chicago days, maybe. Doug saw the show, and he said, "Oh, my God, it's incredible. You did a show about AIDS." And I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, interesting what people can project onto silence." And then Peter Ely saw the show, and he goes, "Wow, man, it's incredible. You did a show about September 11th. Huh." I was like, "Okay, I'll take it." So these pieces are very beautiful. So yeah, Grand Fury. This is a campaign that they did in the 1980s around AIDS. Right, and these two turntables actually played recordings of silence. One of them was the 1-minute silence after Lady Di's death. It was a recording, a field recording essentially from Hyde Park in England. And so they called for 1 minute of silence in which everybody in London was asked to observe. So traffic came to a stop and everything. And so this artist, John T. Semper, made a recording of that 1 minute of silence. And these spheres by Ryan Gander. They feature a laser-etched image of a piece of paper, as it drifts down to the ground. If you drop a piece of paper, the way that it falls. And so it's as if, and there are 100 of them, so it's as if 100 sheets of paper were just like blown by the wind and then came drifting down. And the crystal balls are completely randomly placed. You take 100 plastic balls and throw them on the floor, and then wherever they land, that's where you then place one of the crystal balls. You get this arrangement. Harold Mendez, these are bulletin boards that were on the University of Illinois campus that were stripped of all their announcements. So another kind of silence, visual silence. All right, so that brings us up to monuments. So I mentioned the conceit of the show, which is very lean in terms of juxtaposing decommissioned monuments alongside works of contemporary art. Let's go through. So it's a co-organization between LAX Art and MOCA, and it'll take place, here's a statement about what the show is, right, and contemporary art. And they'll be in dialogue. So let's think more about that. All right. As far as a basis for the show, in terms of thinking about a show of this scale, so we're borrowing 15 monuments from around the country. They're coming from largely throughout the South, but Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Boston, Houston, New Orleans, Birmingham, Alabama, Charlottesville, Richmond. But in terms of the gravity of the show, another show that I was thinking about in organizing it, Without Sanctuary, right, which is a show of lynching photographs that traveled for about 10 years as a show around the country, right? Or Fred Wilson's Minding the Museum show from 1992, which I saw at the Maryland Historical Society. Right, so those are exhibitions. So there are roughly 800 Confederate monuments, statuary in the country. Only 200 of them have come down, but it's important which 200 have come down, right? So the biggest of all of them, New Orleans and Richmond, Monument Avenue. And so in terms of when you see the scale of those monuments, those things are, relatively speaking, kind of like the pyramids. They were built for forever. They were not meant to ever come down in terms of scale of these statues. And in some sense, Richmond having been the capital of the Confederacy, having those monuments come down is kind of like removing the heart, right, I would say. So even though only 200 of them have come down, it's significant that Richmond and New Orleans have come down. That's like, it kind of renders, I would say, a great number of them, which are kind of cookie cutter kinds of, monuments, it pretty much renders them zombies. Right? And pretty much what's on the line, right, is a dismantling of the lost cause. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the lost cause. The lost cause portrays the South as a noble victim. In other words, the generals of the Confederacy fought for timeless principles that somehow transcended the real reason for the Civil War, which is slavery, full stop, period, right? So by downplaying slavery, right, and I think the lost cause, in terms of the reach of the lost cause and the purchase that it has on our imaginations in terms of U.S. history, is quite extensive, right? I grew up being told, no, it was about states' rights, right? The question is, well, states' right to do what? That's the issue, right? So, and so the idea of the monuments coming down, the idea to do the show came about in 2017 after Charlottesville. But like I was saying about the high-rises, the public housing in Chicago, I never expected the monuments to come down in my lifetime. The idea that we would be ready to actually rip out the wiring and go back to square one, right? Think about 1997, Bill Clinton wanting to initiate a national dialogue on race, right? What was the objective of that national dialogue, right? It was considered a failure, right? How can we even begin to have that kind of a dialogue if we can't even agree as to why the Civil War was fought, right? So this moment marks, for me, it's like, oh, wow, okay, so we're ready to actually go there. We're actually ready to have that conversation and just point blank admit once and for all, this is what the Civil War was about, which is quite phenomenal in my mind to get there. So to have the exhibition mark this moment, and this is after the fact of them having come down, right? So that was the impetus, right? So here, right, you're still arguing about why the Civil War was fought, right? You have, self-proclaimed historians, right? It wasn't about slavery, right? And on the other side, don't let anyone tell you different. It was, right? So this is where the monuments are coming, or this is where the monuments, the 800 monuments in terms of a distribution of them. Right? And so this is the protests that went on. 2 waves of them coming down. The exhibition started in 2017, a very different moment than now. It was, this is the curatorial team. And let me see how this goes. It's going to be at the Geffen before I go further into it, just some of the logistics, right? So it's myself doing it with Hamza Walker and Bennett Simpson, who's a senior curator at MOCA. And it'll take place at the Geffen, which is a 40,000 square foot warehouse space in downtown Los Angeles. And so it's able to actually, it's got the square footage, but 2, structurally, it can actually take the weight of the monuments. Right? So here's the background for the exhibition. 2015, this is the Mother Emanuel Church, Charleston, South Carolina. This is where the Dylan Roof, 2015, he walks into the Mother Emanuel Church. He's an avowed white supremacist, neo-Confederate, goes in and kills 9 congregants of the church. This was what sparked the call for the removal of Confederate signs and symbols. So 10 days after that massacre, Bree Newsom went up the flagpole, and that was in Charleston, South Carolina. Dylan Roof was not from South Carolina. He chose the Mother Emanuel Church because he knew its historic significance. It's one of the 2 churches where the African Methodist Episcopal Church was founded, right? And it's also where Denmark Vesey was the founder of the Mother Emanuel Church. So it has deep historical significance. the second thing about the shooting in 2015 was it sent a shudder through the country because it recalled the 1963 bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, of the 16th Street Baptist Church, where the 4 little girls were killed. And so that is still within living memory, right? So the idea of an event well after the Civil Rights Movement, right? That was a key turning point in the Civil Rights Movement, was the bombing of that church. So well after the fact, to have an event of that type take place is what sent, kind of a chill up everyone's spine, right? And now that all belongs to a history of terrorizing black churches, insofar as they were the sites of resistance, political organization, social life. So 10 days after the shooting in Charleston, Bree Newsom goes up the state capitol flagpole, pulls down the Confederate flag, and that's the first call, these things got to come down. Right? It took 2 years for legislation to get through the New Orleans City Council. Mitch Landrieu was the mayor. Relatively speaking, progressive mayor, heeded the call to take them down. There was also political pressure on the ground in New Orleans. But he took the initiative insofar as pushing the legislation through City Council, using his political clout in Capitol, coming from given who he was, his father was a very well-known politician. So he got it through. So New Orleans was the first to fall in 2017. Right? Charlottesville was concurrent with New Orleans, even though New Orleans was the first to come down. So after New Orleans came down, that actually gave the far right time to organize what became the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville shortly thereafter. Right? So they rallied around the Lee statue. In response to the Unite the Right rally, counter-protesters began pulling down the monuments. So the first wave of monument removals, which ran from 2017 up through 2019, 40 monuments came down, essentially, right? And so right after 2017, Charlottesville, counter-protesters said, okay, we're going to start yanking them down. That's what happened in Durham, North Carolina. That's what happened on the left in Frederick, Maryland, right? And that led mayors of cities to declare a public safety hazard. So then mayors said, okay, either white supremacists are going to come from the surrounding area and rally around these things, or protesters are going to yank them down, so we got to be preemptive, we got to pull them down, right? So that was the first wave, right? Second wave, 2020, George Floyd's murder. After that, an additional 150 monuments came down from the middle of June to the end of June, to the end of 2020, in the 6-month period, right? So we had been organizing the show during the first wave of removals, right? Then the second wave comes along, right? So now it's 2020 to the present, but most of those came down in 2020. Right, so now here's some of the ones that we're borrowing. And it's interesting to think about, I was talking about New Orleans, right? Mitch Landrieu pushing legislation through the city council there, right? Very different in a city like Richmond, where the activism was from the ground up in terms of calling for their removal. All right, so here's some of the ones. These are the places we're borrowing from. Yeah. So Richmond, Raleigh, Baltimore, Lynchburg. Right. So it's just in Baltimore. These 4 are coming from Baltimore. Right. So now people say, oh, you're going to put the monuments back up. It's like, no. First of all, they're going to be radically decontextualized. They are not going to be shown outdoors at all. That's way too close to their original locations, right? This is going to be indoors, not on pedestals, right? On the grounds of a contemporary art institution. So, right, that in and of itself to me is a significant change in context. Second, a great number of them are damaged in paint bombs. So they're much more, all of these monuments are now accountable to the present, but a great number of them have scars, let's say, right? So they're much more about 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020 than they are referencing a past. So the one on the right, the Soldier and Sailors Monument, will be shown like this, completely paint bombed. Right, and this is the double equestrian, Lee and Stonewall Jackson. This is a memorial to the women of the Confederacy. And on the left, it's Roger Taney, who was the Supreme Court justice who did the Dred Scott decision, which was kind of the run-up to a key Supreme Court decision that was pretty much the dismantling of the Missouri Compromise, which set the groundwork for the Civil War, right? And I mean, Taney's decision, the Dred Scott decision, went over and above in terms of how it wanted to define the extent to which slaves were property, right? But it also denied blacks citizenship, right? Enslaved or free. So here are the four from Baltimore. So it's coming from New Orleans. This is the Battle of Liberty Place Monument, the only monument to have inscribed on it that it's a monument to white supremacy. That text was later removed. And it was actually, even though the monument dates from 1891, the text was added in 1932. Right? In fact, this photograph was actually taken by Dorothea Lange, right, when she was doing her FSA work. In the 30s, a number of photographers were dispatched throughout the South on the part by the federal government to document life during the Depression. And so this would have been new, which is incredible, this text that she would have turned around and, like, you know, that it caught her attention. But it tells the story of the Battle of Liberty Place, right, in 1891. A group called the White League overthrew the government of Louisiana, the Reconstruction-era government. Then the federal government said, no, you put them back in place. But then 2 years later, the election of 1876, which is the formal end of Reconstruction, they were voted out of office, so the White League felt vindicated, right? And that's a pattern that actually occurs again in the South. Right, here it is. So just to give you a sense, right? And now that text was removed. Now, this monument is a very storied monument, and we've engaged the group Monument Lab to actually make a documentary about this particular monument, its life. So later, this text was added, right, in honor of those Americans, right, on both sides, you know, of the conflict who died in battle. Now, both sides, that should sound familiar. That's what Trump said, right? There are fine people on both sides. Right, so we'll show it, you know, that plaque alongside the object itself. Oh, well, I didn't realize in this presentation I included, but more of the story, right? So 1974. Right? Here's an article about protests around that monument, right? By the NAACP, right? Student chapter of the NAACP in 1974, right? Like people protesting this monument. Right, 1978, the Committee for Accountable Police, the Committee for Accountable Police, right, that's who protested, right, in 1978, right. Now, this is a flyer, just to let you know how this monument was used. David Duke. This was actually a flyer for, right, Hitlerfest in '85, right, and the meeting place was the Battle of Liberty Place Monument. In 1993, right, this is Avery Alexander, who was a state rep protesting David Duke. Right? For those of you who remember who David Duke was a state rep in New Orleans whose phone number was actually the same number as the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. Right? David Duke's still making headlines these days. Right? So, right, 2004, here it is in terms of. Right? So it's a very storied monument. Right? So this is how we'll show it, right? Just completely dismantled with the broken text plaque. right? Boston, the Emancipation Group, right, by Thomas Ball. This is the only monument that was made to actually celebrate the emancipation of the slaves at that time. Right? This went up in 1879. There's a version of it in Washington, D.C., and Thomas Ball is from Boston. A patron in Boston saw the one in D.C. said, hey, would you make a version of it for Boston? And so the one in D.C. will stay up. But it was actually paid for, that one was paid for by former slaves. Raised all the money for the one in D.C. It was a wealthy patron in Boston who paid for this version of it, this copy of it, essentially. Frederick Douglass spoke at the ceremony, taking it down, but in private, he very much hated this monument, in part because, he was at odds with Lincoln being represented as a white savior, right? And so, this, right? Freedom is yours to give, which obfuscates, right, the struggle. Blacks' attempts at self-emancipation, right, which it actually turns out is true of the man who posed for the kneeling slave. And this was taken down because of the representation of the black figure, right, as kneeling. And that's Archer Alexander. It turns out he was a spy for the Union Army. And he tried to get himself out of slavery, which he could have done, but he couldn't get his wife and kids out of slavery. And on another side note, which is just like blows my mind, more reasons to do the show. Turns out he's the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Muhammad Ali. I don't know what you want to do with that. This is coming from Pittsburgh, Stephen Foster Monument. Stephen Foster is considered the father of American popular music, very early 19th century. His string of hits includes My Old Kentucky Home, Camptown Races, Old Black Joe, Old Susanna. He also wrote a lot of music for minstrelsy shows. And here he is penning the song Uncle Ned, which is unsparing in its use of the N word. And this was taken down because of the Uncle Remus figure, right? Had that figure not been there, I don't think this one would have been taken down, right? Despite Stephen Foster's checkered past. Right, the spirit of the Confederacy. This is in the possession of the African American Museum in Houston. That's John Guess, who's the director of the African American Museum. He's wonderful. And when the city took down 2 or 3 of the monuments, John Guest said, no, I don't want a named general. I actually want the spirit, right? The allegorical figure. Winged victory, which I've taken to calling winged defeat. But it's funny, I showed this. Glenn Ligon is on our board. And when I showed Glenn an image of this monument over Zoom, Glenn, if you know Glenn, his glasses, and he leaned forward into the screen. So he's my view of Glenn's face. It's like, and I could see him screwing his eyes up. And I looked at it, I knew, and I was like, yeah, Glenn, yeah, I think of this as the gay Confederate monument too. And he was just like, I didn't want to say anything. What is up with that sword and palm frond? Yeah, so. Josephus Daniels. Josephus Daniels was the founder of the biggest newspaper in North Carolina. He was an avowed white supremacist. He did not believe blacks should have the right to vote. He was, quote unquote, anti-Negro rule. And he used the newspaper as a platform to drum up sentiments resulting in the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. That's the only successful coup on American soil where the government of North Carolina was overthrown by a mob of 2,000 angry white men. And it's very much just like the Battle of Liberty Place. In the Reconstruction era, the Republicans had to court the black vote. And so you had what were called fusion tickets. And they would feature a white governor and a black lieutenant governor, which was the case in North Carolina, right? And so that government was overthrown with no consequences, right? And Josephus Daniels, and we're borrowing this from the family, the Daniels family. And Frank Daniels, who's kind of the family patriarch in a way, really respect him a great deal. It's quite wonderful. I'll do an interview with him for the book, for the catalog. He's great. You know, really, his reflections and considerations, you know, they'll take the monument and they'll put it in the cemetery, you know, on the family plot. And he's like, but it will, no way whatsoever will this man be on a pedestal, you know. But he was a Southern Democrat through and through. So just as soon as he was against blacks having the right to vote, he was very much for women having the right to vote, right, which was the party line. Right. So we're borrowing these street signs from the city of Birmingham, Alabama. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, and the Confederacy's headquarters for the first few months was actually in Montgomery, Alabama. And so you have to think, Montgomery, right, is the site of both the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, the same geographic terrain, right? So you've got one moment in history layered with another moment in history, and if you do streets, this is going to happen, right? So they've since decommissioned Jeff Davis Avenue, and it's become Fred Gray Avenue. Fred Gray is a very prominent civil rights attorney. He was Rosa Parks' attorney, and he's in his 90s and still going at it. You know, and it was very beautiful. We actually have these signs. It's very funny. When they sent them to us, they said, "Oh," and we said, "Yeah, we'll return them. It's a full museum." They're like, "No. You can have them. We don't need them back." And I said, "Okay, it's cool. It's really beautiful. It's like real Southern hospitality." And she said, "Oh, well, I don't know about that because you have to get your own stop sign." I was like, I really like you a lot. This is my kind of city worker. Duchy, insofar as a black man can have a favorite Confederate monument, this is mine. This is the first decommissioned Confederate monument from what we can find in our research. He was actually a German immigrant, actually sculpted it. The city of Elberton, Georgia. It sits on one of the biggest granite veins in North America. They produce well over half of the headstones in the country come out of Elberton, Georgia. And so we're borrowing this from the Elberton Granite Association, which is a consortium of granite quarries in the area. And they have a museum. This is their museum. This is how he's displayed in the museum. But Duchy, the town hated it when it was unveiled, right? And German immigrant, and you can see it's a very, it's archaic, right? It's almost like a medieval sculpture, right? And there's no lexicon in America at that time for understanding what this thing was, you know. So the town hated it, and a group of Confederate veterans who were apparently upset at his resemblance to a Union soldier yanked him down off the pedestal. He broke. They buried him next to the pedestal. He was forgotten about. The town went on to get a new Confederate monument. I don't think they did it because of his resemblance to a Union soldier. I think they did it just because they hated the damn thing. Somebody figured out that he was still there in 1984. Then they dug him up and then ran him through a car wash. And he's since been on display there. And yeah, I really kind of dig it, this sculpture. You know? But I like the fact that it's like, this is not what you think. This was not Black Lives Matter protesters who got to him. It's like, so I like to say, it's like, good to know. Angry people on both sides. So this is coming from Richmond. This is a Jefferson Davis monument, right? And we're borrowing the figure, the allegorical figure at the top and the figure of Jefferson Davis, right, as he has been paint bombed. And the allegorical figure is called the Vindicatrix. The text at the bottom of her base, the Deo Vindice, which was one of the slogans of the Confederacy, God vindicates, right, meaning the South will rise again. But we'll show Jefferson Davis like this, right? He was yanked down off his pedestal. Here he's on display in the Valentine Museum, and we're borrowing it from them. Right, it was great when they took, in the Valentine Museum, took it in, and the conservators said to the director, there's a notable amount of uric acid on the thing. And then the director Bill Martin, who's hysterical. He said, "Are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" And they said, "Yeah." He goes, "I want you to preserve every goddamn molecule of that." Like he's like, "I want you to put the coating over it. Do not remove it. That is part of it now." So, piss and all. This is the biggest of the monuments of war. Matthew Fontaine Murray, he's the general, the admiral of the Confederate Navy. And here he's seen as a man of letters. He's considered the father, lots of fathers in this show, of modern day oceanography and atmospheric sciences. He did the current and tide studies that resulted in very efficient shipping lanes along the eastern seaboard. His very complex relationship to his views on slavery and kind of imperialism at that time. He believed that the future of the United States lay in a relationship with South America. So he wanted to use slave labor to extract natural resources from Brazil. And then you've got this allegorical globe, right? The seas as the source of immigration and peril. And so this is how we'll show him paint bombed. And then we'll show stone from the monuments, notably the Robert E. Lee Monument from Richmond, right? So this is the graveyard of the stone. I took this photograph. That's about 100 yards. It's a football field. And about 3/5 of that football field is just a stone from the Robert E. Lee. Right? So that was 4 stories high. Just the base was 4 stories high. It's like a wedding cake. Right? Then the statue itself was another 20 feet high. So to give you a sense of scale. Right? So here's some of the pieces. Hashtag days without an extrajudicial execution of a U.S. citizen by police. Right, so we'll borrow this slab, which is from the base of the Robert E. Lee statue from Charlottesville. And in addition to that, I don't know if any of you saw in the news the melting down of the Robert E. Lee. That made the news about 3 weeks ago. The Robert E. Lee, the Jefferson School of African American Heritage took possession of the Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville. And they are going to, well, they already have, melt down the Robert E. Lee. And this was the statue that the Unite the Right, the white supremacists rallied around. So they're going to melt it down, give the bronze to an artist to make a new work in 2027, which is the 10-year anniversary of the Unite the Right rally. And in the meantime, we've asked if we could borrow, after they melt it down, the ingots of the Robert E. Lee. Right? So we'll just have the ingots from it. So we'll have Robert E. Lee in the show in substance, but not form. Right? There he is. So and that's along with this piece from the base. So we took possession of the Stonewall Jackson statue, and we gave it to Carol Walker for a new commission. So that'll be the piece that'll be at LAX at our new space, while the group portion of the show will be at the Geffen. So here he is. This is how I spent January 6th of all days, 2022. There he's being carted off, and the base. Beautiful thing with the base. So here's some of the commissioned artists. Right? Abigail DeVille, Natalie Ball, Bethany, Stan Douglas, who we've asked to do a piece taking on what I consider the most effective of all Confederate monuments. People ask, this is in Los Angeles, do you have any skin in the game? What's your relationship to this? Well, Birth of a Nation, right, 1915, arguably did more to spread the lost cause than any piece of bronze. So it's Bethany. She's going to do a piece using the granite, repurposing the granite from one of the bases about the first Memorial Day, which it turns out was by former slaves to mark the Union soldiers. They recognized, they understood that their deaths were for their freedom. And so there was a POW camp in Charleston it was on a horse racetrack, and it had a mass grave. A lot of the soldiers died from exposure, disease. And this group, led by the Patriot Association, a group of black women, wanted to rebury the bodies and have a celebration, which they did, and they called them the Martyrs of the Race Course. So she's going to do a piece around that first, what's considered the first Memorial Day celebration. And it's not Memorial Day in terms of a repeating holiday, but it was the first Memorial Day that recognized the dead. And that only came to light a few years ago, the story of that first Memorial Day celebration. And here's Bethany working with a stone carver. And she's going to do flower petals, rose petals, and that's in process. Kevin Jerome Everson, he's a filmmaker in Charlottesville, teaches at UVA. Bree Newsom was not the first to remove a Confederate flag. In 1984, Richard Bradley removed a Confederate flag that was flown in San Francisco at the Civic Center. It was like a League of Nations show, and they featured the Confederate flag amongst other world flags. But Richard Bradley dressed himself as a Union soldier, climbed up the flagpole 3 times. Dianne Feinstein was mayor. They kept putting it back up. Climbed down, and they had a flag burning ceremony right afterwards. So Kevin Jerome Everson got in touch with Richard Bradley, who's now in his 70s, he's 78, and did a film portrait of him and asked him about, what it took to prepare to climb the pole. And he said, "How did you do it?" And the first thing Richard Bradley said to him is, "Practice, practice, practice," which is the name of the film. It's Karan Davis, she's out of LA. Abigail DeVille, she's doing one of her raucous installations. Natalie Ball, who is Cherokee, Klamath, and Black. So we've asked her to take on a piece about the Cherokee freedmen, right? Those were the slaves owned by the Cherokee Nation. And this stuff, it's American history, right? And, the extent to which people know, right? I mean, obviously, I agree with Ron DeSantis, right? With the question, how is slavery taught, right? I'm like, yes, Ron, that is the question. Now we violently disagree as to how, right, what the issue around that question is, right? But when you learn things, I mean, just like, about the role, the 5 civilized tribes, the fact that they owned slaves, it's complicated. After the war was over, the federal government said, look, you can either become U.S. citizens or you can sign on to the books of the Cherokee Nation. And a number of them said, no, we'll sign on to the books of the Cherokee Nation. Then later in the 80s, the Cherokee Nation actually decided to purge their books and only have it by blood. And it was only literally yesterday, by yesterday I mean like sometime within the last year, that the federal government finally stepped in and said, no, you actually can't do that. You have to recognize the Cherokee freedmen as members of the Cherokee Nation, right? And of all people, it was actually Wilma Mankiller, who was the great, Native American Indian rights activist in the 1970s, who was calling for the purging, right? So it's like, the plot thickens. Khalil Robert Irving asked him to take on border states. He lives in St. Louis. Walter Price, great painter, who was in the Navy. So when I asked Walter and showed him the presentation, he goes, "Oh, man, Matthew Fontaine Murray is mine." It's like, good. That's the response I wanted to hear. Devon Tynes, one of the preeminent baritone opera singers. Spirituals are part of his repertoire. And we've asked him, he's going to do a film work in the Mother Emanuel Church. So it's a way of having the Mother Emanuel Church in the show, right, where it kind of all began. Right? So existing work So here's some of the artists. Run through these real quick. Leonardo Drew, right? This is from 1992. It's about 500 pounds of raw cotton. Black artists using the language of minimalism, abstraction, right? After looking at all this figurative statuary, right? Turquoise Dyson, right? These kind of irregular geometric forms that were called John McCracken's, right? But just, someone asking the thing about, like, it's like, what's the theoretical underpinning for the exhibition? It was just like, what? It's like, no, this is about the work, man. This is something, it's like, I don't know, that I live for. Combinations of work I want to see, right? If you put that Rajatani statue in this room with these two pieces, it's like, Nona Faustine, the White Shoes series. That's her. She photographed herself bare-chested or completely nude. Sites around New York that were either former plantations, slave burial grounds, or auction sites, slave auction sites. Am I going the wrong way? Andre Serrano, the Klan series from 1990. Right, tough stuff. So, wanted to do this before the Philip Guston controversy. And my feeling with that is like, Philip Guston, really? And he's like, let me give you something to cry about, God damn it. It's like, people can't remember. This is art. We've been here before. Right? I mean, I saw these photographs in 1992 with the Morgue series at Feigen. Rebecca, I don't know if you remember that show. The Feigen had the upstairs and the downstairs on Wells. And it was like the morgue was upstairs and the Klan was downstairs. And I limped out of the gallery. It was just like, shit. And I mean, these things are incredible. And I showed these pictures to somebody, and they said, wait, are those real people? I had to laugh. I was like, it's Serrano. This is the upper echelon of the Ku Klux Klan. This is the Cyclops, the Grand Dragon, the Grand Wizard. He photographed them, right? And they wanted him as much as he wanted them, right? So if this was, Annie Leibovitz, I don't know if they would have done it. But they knew of his notoriety because of Pissed Christ. And so this is all about game, recognized game, right? So they said to him when he came, they said, apparently the head of the Ku Klux Klan said to the secretary, hold my calls. I'm having my photograph taken by the infamous Andre Serrano. So they played off of his infamy as much as, like, that's who they wanted to photograph them. It's amazing photographs. You won't be seeing them on the walls of museums anytime soon. But I like the show insofar as it's an excuse to bring this work out, right? To talk about the tough stuff. Martin Puryear. This is based on the cap, about 6 feet high. There you go. You can see. Right, worn by Union and Confederate soldiers. And inside you can see, yeah, there you go, right, the crosshairs. So it's just as much about victims, the high-profile police shootings from 2015, 2014, all the way up through George Floyd. No, it was 2019 that he did this piece. So it didn't include George Floyd. But it's beautiful in artists like Martin Puryear, right? Talking about the relationship between, historic injustice, present-day grievances. Hank Willis Thomas, the Dukes of Hazzard. This is our way of getting the Confederate flag in the show, right? Insofar as its ubiquity within popular culture. Suspension of hostilities. And this is John Henry, photographs of mothers and sons, black mothers and sons, right? To juxtapose it against the memorial to Confederate women, which features a pietà, right? So he asked mothers and sons to adopt the position of the pietà. Right, so here's the series, which I find incredibly moving. Right, and he's done. 50 in this series. I love this one. Right, where 1940 is, it's got, say it's the punctum of the photograph. It's like, is that a time or, a date or an address? It's just incredible the way her hair looks windswept. Yeah, Matthew Fontaine Murray. So these are Walter Price's paintings. So he completed his commission, right? Where he just walked. So this to me is, these paintings are about, they range, but they're about, on average, 6 feet by about 12 feet. And those are his footprints. He walked back and forth. So you guys are getting a super fresh preview, right? And he said, man, I couldn't even hold a brush. The more I read about Matthew Fontaine Murray, I couldn't bring myself to hold a brush for this man. And so he just started walking back and forth on the canvas, right? So this is like I call it like a, you know, Bruce Nauman, Alma Thomas love child, right? And so the idea that Matthew Fontaine Murray made more efficient shipping lanes for commerce, right? In saying that, obviously it's like, as in Middle Passage. They're quite beautiful. It's Bennett snapping a detail. This will be the last one that I'll show. Hugh Mangum. And that's Hugh Mangum on the upper left. Hugh Mangum was a portrait photographer operating from 1894 to 1922 in Raleigh, Durham. And he died, and his glass plate negatives were in a barn on the family property and forgotten about until the family wanted to sell the property in 1974. And they've only recently they were acquired by Duke University and fully digitized, but they're only now beginning to spill out. There was a show of these in New York last year. And that's Hugh Mangum on the upper left, right? But these are amazing photographs in terms of penny portraits. It was a penny portrait studio. But the way that he photographed what you see, individually, in terms of black subjects, one of these photographs is like, yes, seen it. But as a demographic, right, this is like to think that this is 1 or 2 generations outside of the Civil War, right, that you have a black middle class of sorts, right? And just thinking about when he was operating, right, on the eve of the coming of both the Wilmington Massacre and simultaneously the formal passage of Jim Crow, right, Plessy versus Ferguson, right? And then as a demographic, also thinking about the Tulsa Massacre, right, 1919. So these photographs, just what they, and I like how it's a mix, right? It was just, here are the folks of Raleigh, Durham, right? And this one on the lower right, maybe this, right? Yeah, so I'll stop there. We can take questions. I don't know how long I went on, but.
Hello, thank you so much.
Quick preview, and hold on 1 second. Let me shut down my computer with all the windows. Do you want to close everything down? Close it down. There we go.
Hi, over here.
Hi.
Hey. This might be a little out of left field, but I know that our museum here in the collection has a bust of Robert E. Lee as done by Carl Millis, who is we trumpet his works all over campus. He's part of the basis of Cranbrook. So in considering that work currently sits in the collections with a piece of fabric on top of it. covering it. And I'm sort of curious with like your consideration of this exhibition that you're putting together, if you have thoughts on how an institution should contend with things within their own collection.
Sure, it's not, it's a case-by-case basis. Certainly not one size fits all by a long shot or anything. I think things like cloth over things are kind of, for me, somewhat dramatic. They call more attention to things, right? As opposed to, depending on the scale of the work, right? How do you want to contextualize this thing? And it's hardly surprising, right? You've got to, that's what I'm saying about the lost cause. How did the losers of a war fought for the construction of a white ethno-state become like exemplars of civic virtue, of honor, right? And that's an amazing narrative, right? So it's hardly surprising that, Robert E. Lee is the subject of so much art. So it's not even, at that point, it's not even a moral, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, his stature, right, was to be like, it's like, oh, why certain, in some sense, right? There are statues and busts, all, and things named after him all over the country, right, by that point. So that's what I mean by the purchase that it had on our imagination, right? So, to use it as an occasion to talk about the lost cause, and I don't think it's anything, I don't know, in terms of claws over things or something, and growing up, it's like, this is a personal note, did I feel like oppressed by, statues? It's like, no, I didn't feel oppressed by statues growing up, running around Baltimore. Now, did I know what they were in some sense and what, like, it's like, no. I think that if you poke that wasp's nest, it's like, this is what it will stir up a unite the right. This is, what this thing is capable of in terms of the kind of sentiments that will coalesce around it, right? But now, wanting to believe, in terms of, our capacity for change, and having events that we can't go back, right? Like, so in terms of how we see things, right? So like I was saying, there might be 800, but the 200 that have come down have rendered the rest of them, so it's like, all right, we know what this is. The jig is up on it. It can stay there, whatever. But and I know that this is the site of these, and if you want to go on and rally around it, whatever. But we know what it is, right? Or that there's a total counter narrative going on around this thing. So you want to stand up and rally around it, So, I'd like to think of, and of all places to be able to conduct that kind of discussion, it'd be the museum, right? So, treating it, certain gestures kind of speak much more to a kind of, and I don't want to race the term fragility, but it's like the cloth over it. But I feel like it's like, no, what do you got hiding under that? It's like, out with it.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
At this point, I don't want to believe somebody's going to call Operation Push.
Hi there. I was curious how you go about choosing the artists that respond to these sculptures. Like, you went through artists responding to different ones. Like, how does that process come about?
The show has evolved over time, right? So starting in 2017, the conception for the show was very, very different than 2020, right? 2020, after George Floyd's murder, that was like saying, okay, in terms of the legacy of slavery, everything is everything. It's all connected, right? So that was the kind of, and so the show got a lot messier, right? Productively so. So in terms of, the first thing was to say, no, in terms of blue chip, no. Carrie Mae Weems, no. Glenn Lagon, no. Even though they've all produced amazing work, Dawood Bey, they've all done great work, right? in terms of the thing. And I'd already approached Kara about co-curating the show. So in terms of her commission, that was that's anomalous. That has a kind of a special thing about it. But as far as the selection of the artists, removing all of the kind of like blue chip obvious figures that one will go for in favor of a much more no, Martin Puryear. Like a place that you wouldn't expect to find Martin is where I want to put Martin, right? It's like, oh, yeah. Like, so that has the kind of, Popel is one of those like guests that could show up to any party, anytime, anywhere, and you don't know what the fuck you're gonna get, right? It's like, all right, whatever you want to do, man, floor is yours. He's such an X factor, right? But in terms of generationally, to kind of kick it down, right? So instead of the kind of more recognizable, blue chip names, to be a little bit more like Leonardo Drew. It's like, oh yeah. What about abstraction in a way, right? And not that I'm a big fan of the term Afrofuturism per se, but turquoise and kind of like, if I'm going to flirt with it, that's how I'm, more inclined to do it. Natalie Ball, right? Like it's like oh no. Let's have that narrative in terms of let's open up American history, like for full and those kinds of things. So, younger, different generations take, especially after 2020, right? And all the facets. So that was the real. If there was any overarching directive behind the selection, that's as close as I can get to an overarching thing. Then it was like, all right, going through and finding case by case in terms of, who might be an interesting commission.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Thank you so much. I have two questions. One kind of off of Madison's. Did you possibly consider Alicia B. Wormsley's billboard, There Are Black People in the Future?
Oh. I titled an essay on Kara, this is a long time ago, or not that long, 20 years ago, it was long enough. She did a piece, she did these crazy temporary tattoos, which she was like, if you were French, she was like handing them out like in this really sheepish way. She did these temporary tattoos in German Gothic font that said "nigger lover" on them, and I was just like, Kara, damn girl. So I read this thing and I titled it "Nigger Lover" or "Will There Be Any Black People in Utopia?" Right, as a thing, right, about what are we going to, how do we configure the question of race in our projection of the future, right? Right? So, in terms of a conundrum, so that was my, as a thought problem, right? So, in terms of that piece, I thought of it as it's more of a witticism than a work with a certain kind of muscle or girth to me, having arrived at that, by another way.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also curious too, like if this exhibition will travel and if so, obviously there are like restrictions based on the weight of the monuments, but like what it would, your hopes that conversation would have if it goes back to the South or? In discussion, a couple of the venues. As far as the structure of the exhibition, I characterize it as a pizza, right? And so you can do it, not recognizing that places don't have a Geffen, right? So whole or by the slice, right? Where the slice is representative of the whole, right? So if you have a monument and a work of contemporary art in spirit, that's the show, right? So if you're a university gallery, you can do an iteration of the show with no problem. So it can have different you can do a redux off of this, just because I think of it as a relatively generous spread, in a way. So, and then things like, it's like, what would just, even without the monuments, what would the contemporary work look like? Interesting question. Don't know, but I'd be curious.
So yeah, the variations and permutations, you know, and combinations, I would say, you know, are many. So.
Hello, thank you for that. I'm really curious, like curating an exhibition, and I know it's coming out in a couple of years, so you might not have maybe
It was
thought
originally slated for now. But
Well-
it got postponed for 2 years out.
so you might be already thinking about these things and having these conversations, but what is going to happen to like contextualization and like programming and didactics? Like, how are you treating these things in terms of the statues? Because I'm thinking about this also in an educating lens, right? Like whoever comes to the exhibition learns more about who these people are and their histories, but like, how are you going to do that?
Well, just an anecdote about public programs, which are a central component of the project as a whole, right? So you've got the exhibition, the catalog, public programs. So we did a draft of the public programs just as a draft. Like, it's like, okay, what kind of topics are we looking at, right? Our historical dimension, the art historical dimension, the social dimension, right? Now, the social dimension then, you know, after, you know, there's 2020, right? And so we did one draft, and then it was like, okay, well, that draft is now out of date. We got to do another draft of the public programs, right? So then January 6th happened, right? The wholesale attempt to disenfranchise black voters. And so then it's just, you know, the code word, election integrity, right? And so, and now we have Florida, right? So it's beautiful the way that the show is evolving, and to think it's like, oh no, it doesn't matter. We could do it now. We could do the show 2 years from now. It won't matter. Its tentacles it's like, it's so part of American history that it's in the headlines in some way, shape, or form every day, and it's stuff that's going to happen between now and then. So I told Hannah, I was like, it's like, let's just wait before we do another draft of the public programs to see how the story unfolds. You know, so. In terms of didactics, it's you know, just doing the first drafts of the floor plan, right? You've got A is the contemporary art, B are the monuments, then the relationship between A and B as a third thing. The fourth thing, C, is going to be the kind of interpretive, right? The kind of text, right? How is certain kind of information mediated, right? And it's not like the didactics or texts are a thing unto themselves. You know, Bennett and I have been going back and forth, and we were just like, no. We actually have to think of that as an actual component of the exhibition in terms of its layout, because that's going to be really key. So it's not like we have to treat that as though it were a work of art in the show, right? In terms of placement and where and how it's engaged, right? It's that integral to the reception of the pieces. And in some senses, you know, we're going to have handouts, you know, because in terms of the historical dimension, you know, what there is to know about the personage, the events, and it goes on. So let's just say it's a lot.
Thank you.
And then there's the 400-page catalog.
Hi, thanks for letting us inside your process. I am thinking about like how you're making work about history as it happens, and like how you navigate dealing with the present and like the museum's role, like when a topic is history enough to be in a museum.
Oh.
And so like you're dealing with it as it's unfolding.
Right.
And I'm looking at like what's going on in Germany in the art world, and just like Israel, Palestine, and how it's just like shutting art down because people can't deal with the present. So how do you like find that sweet spot of like the safe topic but still be able to push it?
That's the field. That's the draft, right? It's like, how contemporary can contemporary art be, right? In some sense, and we're at a moment right now where this stuff is like hot, right? So the role of things is like, no, you know, I'm trying to give a good example.
where it's like, how do you narrate the present? And I mean, first of all, the very issue of the possibility for the present moment to achieve legibility, period, let alone through works of art, right? That unto themselves have declared the issue of legibility, right? What they might be saying to us is, no, all bets are off. The present is hopelessly illegible, right? Stop making sense. So that's already a tenuous proposition, right, to take on. But this is the kind of question that I live for in terms of the field. That, to me, is one of the central things. Like, so the role of allegory, right? I can't tell you about now, but what I need to do is I need to create a story, right? And you'll follow the story, and you'll be able to map the story onto now. But I can't talk about now as it's like, no. I have to remove myself from now in order for you to try and get at it through another means, right? So right now I'm quite, and have for a while been fascinated with the uses of allegory, especially at moments of crisis, in a sense, or acute pressure, and especially now with like a demand to say something, right? Maybe it's already been said, and we just did, and maybe it's too loud. So, but also things like information, right? What is the work of art's relationship to, what does art do that reading the newspaper doesn't do, right? What is the nature of the arts experience? And this is where I just am into, this is what drives the field, or at least these are the questions to me that I circle around in terms of organizing exhibitions and engaging with work, in terms of orchestrating the arts experience to some sense, or how is it mediated through the organization of exhibitions. But things like, it's like, what is it? What does it do? And in some sense, that's a question not to be answered per se, right? It's answered with each and every different piece of art, right? But what is it that we look for? How does it both inform us, make us laugh, make us cry, right? That's different somehow than just like reading the newspaper and information, right? Like what separates this from like a documentary? How does art, but that question is quite important in relationship to the contemporary, the contemporariness of the work, right? But yeah, so no answer, but just, I'm absolutely enthralled by that very question, right? Yeah.
I don't know if I should ask this question. I was curious about, because you've been so immersed in monuments and I was curious, and bringing in people to do more contemporary things with these monuments, but that's a response. I guess I'm curious about what a contemporary monument would be, if you've ever been thinking about that. And then, do we need them? What do they look like? Like, it may be an unfair question because you've been immersed in something else. I was just curious of your take on that.
The impulse to erect them, to have them, I don't think we can, by the time that idea, that notion would happen, I want to see what society looks like. A society that suddenly said, it's like, no monuments at all. Like, was like, what kind of society is that? What's the social structure and organization of a culture that held no need to do this? Or at least insofar as like how we understand, monuments in a certain sense. Yeah. At least in like, statuary sense, which I think is.
Yeah, maybe I'm not talking about statuary. That's what I was saying.
Right. I mean, that's
like just curious, like what do we need now?
Yeah, it's interesting what like I was saying, Birth of a Nation
performed a function as a film in terms of delivering a message that, and that was early cinema, right? So that was a delivery system that was brand new. That suddenly, and then to have to think of something like the statues after Birth of a Nation, right? So even the Stonewall Jackson statue, which I just showed briefly, is very that's totally cinematic, But yeah, the fleeting, the ephemeral, the quotidian, right? So when I think about, it is, I guess I'm not so much, not the issue is about monuments themselves or what they'll be going forward or the need for them, as much as how they operate dialectically in relationship to the everyday and the ordinary and the quotidian and the ephemeral and the things that are relatively fleeting, but still play some form of cultural collective consciousness or tissue, connective tissue somehow, and that's actually proves to be, it's which is more powerful, right, bronze or air, right? Arguably air is a lot more powerful than a discrete, we need that to live. We breathe it and it's everywhere, right? So what about work that functions much more along those lines, in terms of how it's distributed, or how we think about, we don't even think about it, right? It's invisibility and perhaps taken for grantedness, but yet nonetheless placed in our lives, supersedes anything that kind of focuses our attention in any
Yeah, because you were mentioning the cultural imaginary, and that's where my brain went, it's just.
Yeah, but then there are those artists who, I was just talking about Jan Vo, We the People, right? The dismantling of the brilliant piece, right? The Statue of Liberty piece, right? And then its distribution, right? Talking about Henry Kissinger dying, right? It was nice to be able to talk about Jan Vo, right? In that aftermath. So things, of that order. So Felix Gonzalez Torres, right? In terms of any kind of, and that it's too monumental to even call the work anti-monumental, right? It's just something else in terms of the equilibrium with life. What could be, in some sense, what's more monumental than that?
Thanks.
Maybe on that note.
Yeah. Oh, we have one more. Does that T-shirt say Def Leppard? No. Oh, just checking.
Hi, thank you. This was really interesting for me because I'm from Houston, so I've actually seen the Spirit of the Confederacy statue, and I also was living in Houston when it was taken down, and I was reading articles about the decision of what to do with it afterwards, and how there was a lot of careful consideration of should it be destroyed, should it be, what should happen to it, and the decision ended up being on centering it in recontextualizing it in an educational context. Mm-hmm. And so you were talking about different conversations, when are we ready to have these conversations? So my question is just, what kinds of conversations are you hoping to curate out of this exhibition?
That's a good one. First, a note on the issue of contextualization. Yeah, that discussion about, recontextualizing the, plaques and things like that. I think that one of the most powerful acts of recontextualization are the issue of stewardship, right? So who owns the things, right? So in the case, the Black History Museum of Virginia, they're the owners of all the ones that came down off of Monument Avenue, right? So the African American Museum, what does it mean? Suddenly it's where it is and who has it, that automatically tells you something about how you're going to look at it, right? That to me is that's probably one of the most powerful frames you could have around these things, so to move them in that direction. In terms of conversations, I already characterized the show as very messy, right? So I don't know about curating any conversations as much as just like, I mean, to use one of the expressions, the Black vernacular, everything is everything, you know, in some sense, right? And again, the tentacles and how many things that this, you know, the legacies of slavery, like in terms of what it touches on, right? So to court and use the word, you know, to curate those kinds of conversations with respect to public programs, right? To have them, to have those conversations and those programs reflect, you can't reflect, well, you know, all the facets or aspects that, you know, these monuments would touch upon, and they're coming down. But to get a sense, at least through the public programs, of the wealth of them, right? So to structure them in a way where you get a sense of like, oh wow, there's a lot, you know, and to have them, you know, I mean, some of them will be very, you know, academic in nature. Others not, right? That to say about specificity. So to have some of them really talk about like a who, what, when, where is important to me within it as a kind of grain or kernel. Because I just feel like when we talk about monuments, we talk about them as a category or class of object. We don't talk about them like, well, wait, which monument are you talking about, right? Let alone they're in traffic medians, right? They're up and removed. So we never really look at them, right? So then there's the issue of them in terms of their gross material qualities and stuff. So to have them, so that kind of specificity, right, in terms of like, what are these 15 objects and what do they say and what are their histories as objects? And I want that kind of specificity in the public programs as well, right? So that's important to me if I were going to put a kind of curatorial directive running through those programs. Say to give them some real, the same kind of grit that I hope is in the show in terms of the objects on display, right? So that we aren't approaching it from 30,000 feet, but much more. You know, what about these monuments? What can we say about them? And learn.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.